The wind tore across the open plains like a living thing, sharp and cold, carrying dust, dry grass, and the promise of a coming storm. It howled through the emptiness, as if warning anyone brave or foolish enough to travel this far west. Eleanor felt that wind bite into her skin as the wooden wagon jolted forward, its wheels groaning over the rough dirt road. Her fingers were numb from gripping the leather handle of her small suitcase, but she did not loosen her hold. She had already lost too much to let go now. She had been on the road for days. Each mile felt heavier than the last, pressing down on her chest with the weight of doubt. This journey was supposed to change her life. That was what the letters promised. A home, a husband, a place where she would finally belong. Yet deep inside, Eleanor had never fully believed it. Hope, she had learned, was fragile, and the world had broken hers more than once. The townspeople along the way had not tried to hide their whispers. She heard them in passing glances and lowered voices. The mail-order bride no one wanted. The woman who had been passed over again and again. Eleanor kept her eyes forward and her back straight. She had learned long ago that answering cruelty only gave it power. She had left everything behind. The small village where she grew up. The dusty inn where she worked from sunrise to nightfall. The quiet dream that one day someone might look at her and see more than a burden. All of that was behind her now. Ahead stood Blackthorn Ranch. The gates rose before her, wide and heavy, opening onto land that seemed to stretch forever. Golden fields rolled toward the horizon, broken only by fences and distant hills. The main house stood firm at the center, its weathered wood darkened by years of sun and wind. Smoke drifted gently from the stone chimney, steady and calm, as if the house itself was breathing. Eleanor swallowed hard. Her heart beat so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the yard. This was the moment she had imagined countless times. She pictured a man stepping forward, smiling, welcoming her into the life she had been promised. She pictured warmth, acceptance. Before she could knock, the front door opened. James Blackthorn stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched by the early morning light. His face was unreadable, as his eyes met hers, sharp and steady, measuring her in a single glance. He looked like a man shaped by hard work and harder choices, someone who did not waste words or trust easily. "You must be Eleanor," he said. His voice was deep and calm, carrying authority without cruelty. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She had practiced what she would say during the long journey. Words of thanks, words of respect, but now they vanished, leaving only silence. James stepped aside. "Come in. You must be tired." It was not warmth, but it was not rejection either. Eleanor crossed the threshold, clutching her suitcase as if it were the last piece of her old life. Inside, the house smelled of polished wood, leather, and faint wildflowers. The furniture was simple but cared for, placed with purpose. Everything spoke of order and solitude. She set her suitcase down, the sound echoing in the quiet room. A sudden fear rose in her chest. What if she did not belong here either? What if this was just another place that would turn her away? The days that followed were careful and uncertain. Eleanor learned the rhythms of the ranch. She fed the horses at dawn, mended fences under the wide sky, and worked in the garden until her hands were sore. James watched from a distance, saying little, but she felt his eyes on her, judging not her appearance, but her effort. The gossip from nearby farms reached her ears soon enough. Some spoke with pity, others with suspicion, a few with open scorn. Eleanor kept her head down and continued working. She refused to let their words define her. James was not like the others. He was stern, reserved, and slow to trust, but he was fair. Sometimes he nodded in approval. Once in a while, when he thought she was not looking, his expression softened into something close to a smile. Those small moments warmed her more than the fire ever could. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky in amber and purple, Eleanor sat alone on the porch. The wind moved through the trees, carrying distant laughter from a neighboring farm. The sound twisted something deep inside her. It reminded her of everything she had never had. That night, Doubt settled into her bones. The feeling of being unwanted returned, quiet but sharp. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. By morning, she had made her decision. If she did not belong here, she would leave before she became another disappointment. At dawn, Eleanor packed her things with trembling hands. She wrote a short note for James, thanking him for his kindness and apologizing for the trouble she had caused. The first light spilled across the fields as she lifted her suitcase and moved toward the door. Her fingers had barely touched the handle when a firm hand closed around her arm. She turned, heart racing, to find James standing behind her. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with something she had never seen before. "You're not leaving," he said. His voice was low and rough, carrying an edge of fear beneath the command. Eleanor tried to pull back, words rushing to her lips. She did not want to be a burden. She did not want to beg to stay. "I don't belong here," she whispered. James shook his head once. "You're not walking away at dawn, not alone." The words hit her harder than any rejection ever had. She searched his face, looking for doubt, for pity, for obligation. She found none. Only certainty. For the first time since she began this journey, Eleanor felt seen. Not as a rejected bride, not as a mistake, but as a person worth keeping. She did not know what the future held. She only knew that when James said stay, something inside her finally believed she could. The days after James stopped Eleanor from leaving were quiet, but the quiet felt different now. It was no longer empty or heavy. It was careful, almost thoughtful, as if the ranch itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor moved through her chores with a new awareness, feeling the weight of James's words settle deep inside her. Stay. It echoed in her mind as she fed the horses, scrubbed the floors, and tended the small garden behind the house. James did not speak much about that morning. He did not explain himself, and Eleanor did not ask. Yet something between them had shifted. His instructions came softer, his gaze lingering longer than before. When their hands brushed while passing a tool or a plate, neither of them pulled away too quickly. There was still distance, but it was no longer cold. Winter crept in slowly at first. The mornings grew sharper, the nights longer. Frost clung to the grass like a thin veil, and the wind returned with more force, howling across the open land. Eleanor rose before dawn each day, wrapping herself in layers, determined to prove that staying had not been a mistake. The nearby townspeople did not make it easy. When Eleanor rode into town with James for supplies, conversations paused. Eyes followed her. Some faces softened with curiosity, others hardened with judgment. She heard her name spoken in low voices, paired with words like strange and unwanted. The old ache stirred inside her, but she held her head high. James noticed. He always did. One afternoon, as they loaded grain into the wagon, a man from a neighboring ranch stepped too close, his tone sharp and mocking. Eleanor felt herself shrink, old habits pulling at her spine. Before she could respond, James stepped forward, placing himself between them. "She's with me," he said calmly. There was no threat in his voice, only certainty. The man backed away without another word. Eleanor said nothing, but something warm spread through her chest. For the first time, someone had claimed her without shame. As winter tightened its grip, the work grew harder. Fences broke under the weight of snow. Livestock fell ill. Eleanor's hands cracked and bled despite her gloves. Some nights she fell into bed too tired to speak. Yet she did not regret staying. Each challenge made her stronger, more certain that she belonged here. James began to rely on her more than he realized. He asked her opinion on repairs, on meals, on small decisions that once belonged only to him. Eleanor offered her thoughts carefully at first, afraid of overstepping. When he listened, truly listened, her confidence grew. Evenings became their quiet refuge. They sat by the fire, sharing meals in comfortable silence or exchanging simple stories. Eleanor spoke of the inn where she grew up, of long days serving travelers who never learned her name. James spoke of his father, of inheriting the ranch young, of learning to survive without help. Each shared memory loosened another brick in the walls they had built around themselves. But peace never lasts forever. The first major storm hit without mercy. Snow fell thick and fast, driven sideways by violent winds. The sky turned dark by midday, swallowing the land whole. James moved quickly, preparing the ranch as best he could. Eleanor followed, fear pounding in her chest as the storm worsened. That night the blizzard roared like a living beast. The house shook. Windows rattled. Somewhere beyond the walls, an animal cried out. Eleanor lay awake, listening, her heart racing. Memories of past rejections returned, whispering that she did not deserve safety, that this peace could vanish at any moment. By morning, the damage was clear. A section of fence had collapsed. One of the horses was missing. James did not hesitate. He pulled on his coat and reached for his gear. Eleanor watched him, dread tightening her chest. The storm had not fully passed. The wind still cut deep, the cold unforgiving. "I'm coming with you," she said. James turned sharply. "No, I won't stay here wondering if you'll come back," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. They rode into the white blur together, the world reduced to wind, snow, and the sound of hooves. Eleanor's face burned with cold, her fingers numb, but she refused to slow down. When they found the horse tangled near a fallen tree, fear gave way to determination. Together they worked to free it, shouting over the storm, moving as one. By the time they returned to the house, both were exhausted, shaking from cold and adrenaline. Inside, Eleanor struggled to light the fire, her hands trembling too much to strike the match. James took over without a word, his jaw tight. The tension that had built all day finally broke. "You didn't have to come," he said sharply. "I wasn't going to hide," Eleanor shot back. "Not again." Silence fell heavy between them. The fire crackled. The storm howled outside. Eleanor's voice softened. "I've spent my life being told I'm too much or not enough. I won't be invisible here." James closed his eyes briefly, the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing into his shoulders. "I don't know how to protect someone else," he admitted quietly. "I barely know how to protect myself." The honesty stunned her. She stepped closer, unsure but resolute. "We learn," she said, "together." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. That night they sat side by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sharing warmth and silence. No promises were made, none were needed. The weeks that followed tested them again and again. Supplies ran low. A neighboring ranch challenged the boundaries of James's land, claiming old deeds as proof. Eleanor overheard the heated argument, fear twisting her stomach. This was no longer just James's fight. It was hers, too. She stood beside him when the rival rancher arrived, her presence quiet but firm. She spoke calmly, pointing out details in the papers James had overlooked. Her voice did not shake. When the man left, frustrated and empty-handed, James looked at her with new eyes. "You're stronger than you think," he said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "So are you." Still, doubt lingered. On the hardest nights, Eleanor wondered if staying was only delaying another goodbye. Those fears came to a head during one bitter evening, when exhaustion turned small words into sharp ones. The argument flared fast, fueled by stress and old wounds. "I can leave," Eleanor said, the words tearing at her throat. "I won't force myself where I'm not wanted." James stepped in front of the door, his expression fierce and desperate. "Not alone," he said. "Not ever." Something broke open between them then. They spoke through the night, voices low, raw, honest. Eleanor shared the pain of every rejection. James confessed his fear of losing control, of caring too deeply. When dawn came, the storm inside them had eased. Winter slowly loosened its hold. Snow melted. The land breathed again. Eleanor stood on the porch one morning, watching the sunrise spill gold across the fields. James joined her, close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not pull away. For the first time, Eleanor believed staying was not an act of fear, but one of courage. And whatever waited ahead, She knew she would face it here. Spring arrived slowly at Blackthorn Ranch, as if the land itself needed time to trust that winter was truly gone. Snow retreated from the fields in narrow streams, feeding the dry earth and waking the grass beneath. The air softened, carrying the smell of damp soil and new life. Eleanor felt that change inside herself as well. The woman who once packed her bag at dawn no longer watched the horizon with fear. She watched it with purpose. Life did not suddenly become easy. The rival rancher returned more than once, pressing his claims and stirring trouble among the neighbors. Old tensions rose to the surface, and rumors spread through town like wildfire. Some said Eleanor was the reason James had grown distracted. Others claimed she was after his land. Each whisper cut deep, but Eleanor no longer carried them alone. James stood firm. He met every challenge head-on, his voice steady, his actions clear. Eleanor stood beside him, not behind. She kept records, organized supplies, and spoke with neighbors who were willing to listen. Slowly, opinions began to shift. People saw her working from sunrise to sunset, her hands rough, her back straight. They saw she was not passing through. She was staying. One afternoon, trouble came hard and fast. A fence was torn down in the night. Livestock wandered close to dangerous ground. James rode out early, anger burning in his chest. Eleanor followed, sensing the weight of the moment. When they reached the damaged boundary, they found the rival rancher waiting, his men standing close. Words were exchanged, sharp and bitter. Accusations flew. The situation teetered on the edge of violence. Eleanor felt fear rise, but she did not step back. She stepped forward. She spoke clearly, calmly, pointing to landmarks older than any deed. Marks that had guided the land for generations. She reminded them of shared winters, shared losses, and the cost of fighting neighbors instead of weather. Her voice did not tremble. The standoff ended without bloodshed. The rival turned away, defeated not by force, but by resolve. As they rode home, James looked at Eleanor with something close to awe. "You saved this ranch," he said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "We did." That night, they sat on the porch as the sky darkened and stars appeared one by one. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was full. "I used to think I had to do everything alone," James said, "that needing someone made me weak." Eleanor met his gaze. "I used to think staying meant begging to be chosen." Their eyes held. Understanding passed between them, deep and unspoken. The next weeks brought steady progress. Crops took root. Animals grew strong. The house felt warmer, filled with shared laughter and small routines. Eleanor baked bread in the mornings. James repaired tools in the evenings. Sometimes they worked side by side in silence. Other times they talked until the sun slipped away. Yet one fear remained, quiet but persistent. Eleanor had learned to trust this place, this man, but part of her still waited for the moment it would all be taken away. That moment came when a letter arrived. It bore the seal of the agency that had arranged her journey. The words were formal and cold. A mistake had been made, it said. Another man had claimed her contract. By law, she was expected to report to him. Eleanor's hand shook as she read the letter again and again. Old wounds reopened in an instant. She felt small, powerless, like the unwanted woman she once was. James found her sitting at the table, the letter crumpled in her fist. He read it slowly, his face hardening. "They can't force you," he said. "They can," Eleanor replied softly. "I've always belonged to someone else's decision." James stood abruptly, pacing the room. Anger burned in his eyes, but beneath it lay fear. The thought of losing her cut deeper than he expected. "You belong here," he said. "With me." Eleanor looked up, tears blurring her vision. "Do you mean that?" she asked. "Or are you just afraid to be alone again?" James stopped. He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I choose you," he said. "Not because I need help, not because I'm afraid, because I love you." The words settled between them, heavy and real. Eleanor's breath caught. She had dreamed of hearing those words, yet never truly believed they were meant for her. Now they were. The next morning, they rode to town together. James spoke to the officials. He presented evidence, witnesses, and records. Eleanor stood beside him, steady and unyielding. This time, she did not wait to be claimed. She claimed herself. The decision was made. The contract was void. Eleanor was free. When they returned to the ranch, the weight she had carried for years finally lifted. She stood in the open field, the wind brushing her face, and laughed. It was a sound she barely recognized, light and unguarded. James joined her, pulling her into his arms. She did not hesitate. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Summer followed, rich and full. The ranch flourished. Neighbors came to respect, even admire, the woman who had once been dismissed. Eleanor became part of the land, her presence as natural as the rising sun. One evening, as fireflies danced in the tall grass, James led her to the edge of the field. He did not kneel. He did not offer grand words. "I want you here," he said, "not just to stay, to build a life." Eleanor smiled through tears. "I never planned to leave." They married quietly, without spectacle, surrounded by open sky and honest hearts. The ranch stood witness, its fields stretching wide, holding their promise. Years later, Eleanor would sometimes think of the woman who once faced dawn alone, suitcase in hand, ready to disappear. She would smile at the memory, not with sadness, but with gratitude, because staying had not been surrender. It had been the bravest choice she ever made. And at Blackthorn Ranch, she was no longer rejected. She was home.